Thanks. All right. Just test this. Can everybody hear me? Wow. A little bit. I feel like Lady Gaga with this. So, hola? Hola? Bon dia? All right, that's all I know. And it's going to be in English from here on. Thank you for coming. Really honored to have been asked to come down here. My name is Mike Kruzeniski. I work on the Windows Phone design team up in Seattle. And the talk that I'm going to give is called Mobile Now, which is, it's the best title I could think of for basically just talking about some of the things that are interesting to me right now. And I work in mobile. And I work in Windows Phone. And I guess this talk is actually kind of a combination of 3 different talks that I've done over the course of the past year, talking about some of the different things we've been thinking about. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of bring them together and talk about these different topics as one. So, like I said, I work on Windows Phone. These are the 3 things that I'll be covering over the next hour. So the first is, I guess, the design of Windows Phone, which, if you've seen Windows Phone and what we've done, I think, the Metro design, if you've heard that word, the design approach that we've taken is, I think, what's caught a lot of people's attention as sort of a different approach to UI design. The second thing I'm going to talk about is apps and our approach to applications and sort of what applications mean in mobile and right now. And then the last bit is something that I've been sort of more passionate about recently is just ecosystems and thinking about how you create an ecosystem, how do you sort of grow and nurture an ecosystem, and I guess some of our thoughts on that and our approach towards that. So first bit, design. Like I said, I work on Windows Phone, and if you haven't seen Windows Phone before, this is our lock screen. This is one of the screens on our phone. And what you'll notice about it is it's very much it's very type-centric. It's a very clean UI. We don't have a lot of or really any sort of gloss or the sort of visual polish that you might be used to in a lot of UI design. We pretty much just stuck to text. Very simple, clean, light, open approach. And this is what it looked like just a couple years ago. Very much the opposite of that. So this was Windows Mobile 6. And one of the things that sort of, if you deconstruct this UI, what you notice is it's made up of a lot of this stuff. And we refer to this stuff as Chrome. I've heard other people refer to it as UI furniture. Basically, it's just all the kind of stuff that's in a UI that isn't the content. So if I own this phone, this isn't my information. This is just sort of all the glossy, chromy stuff that the UI designers working on it thought would be really interesting to make the screens look really shiny. And we're not the only ones who were taking that approach. That's actually kind of how most UI design has been, the last several years. And if you look at these 4 phones, these are 4 phones from 4 very represent 4 very fierce competitors. If you work in mobile, you'll know that the mobile industry is very, very competitive. And so these are 4 distinct competitors who are really trying to differentiate themselves in the market. And if you look at the UIs, essentially, they all kind of look the same. They're taking the same sort of UI visual approach. One has a drop shadow sort of to the left, and one has a drop shadow to the right. And other than that, they're kind of the same visual design idea. And when I think about how did we get to a point where the competition who's trying to differentiate itself so much is essentially all kind of copying each other? I think about, where did interaction design come from, and why is everybody using the exact same approach to interaction and UI design? And so I'm going to walk through a bit of what I think of sort of the brief history of interaction design and what I think has led us to this kind of approach in UI design. And when I think of the beginning of UI design, I think of Vannevar Bush's Memex machine, which was a proposal that he had written up in an Atlantic Monthly in 1945. So it wasn't an actual thing. It was just a description of an idea. Is anybody who's familiar with the Memex? Okay, so basically it was he was describing his perfect sort of desk that he would have in his office, that he would be able to have all his documents and journals inside of it, and this sort of contraption would allow him to call up that different information when he needed it. So, for example, he would have these 2 sort of tablets on the desk, And on one, he'd be able to call up a document or a journal. And on the other one, he'd be able to write some annotations on it. And so, you know, it's an interesting idea. And actually, this specific idea is pretty much hyperlinking. And a lot of people look at what he was describing in the Memex as sort of the blueprint for the modern web and the kind of interactivity we're really familiar with today. And, you know, even though he didn't build it, it was very, very influential for a lot of the people who were working in computing and UI design at the very beginning. So in the 1970s, you have Xerox PARC and the Stanford Research Institute sort of working on this, these kinds of ideas. And Douglas Engelbart, who was, if you're familiar with him, you know, he was one of the foremost researchers working at Xerox PARC and Stanford. And he cited Vannevar as a, you know, a really important influence for him in thinking about what he was in his work. And so if you look at, you know, the first graphic user interface, you know, he was essentially kind of trying to build a lot of the ideas that was in Vannevar's Memex machine. You'll even see sort of the portrait orientation of the screen is the same as the tablets that were in Vannevar's proposal. And then those ideas were sort of built on for the next several years, where the idea of this is a desktop. You know, Vannevar's original idea that it was like he was going to take his desk and he was going to have all his content within inside the desk. And that idea is sort of, you know, we're all familiar with the term desktop. That idea was then nurtured over the next several, basically the next decade, where, you know, you'll notice even some of the metaphors on the left-hand side of the one screen, where there's scissors, there's a knife, which still looks very familiar today if you're using any Adobe products. This kind of palette of metaphorical tools of things that would have been in your desk that now we're trying to put inside of the computer. The Xerox Star interface, which then kind of cemented a lot of those ideas, and you start to see the desktop metaphors take a lot more shape. You see floppy icons and folder icons on the desktop. Years later, with both, you know, Apple's first interfaces and Windows as well, you know, those ideas are becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, and this is going over the course of, you know, several decades, where people are refining this idea of the desktop and, you know, making these kinds of physical metaphors more and more real. You know, in some case, there was some sort of offshoots of that where people were really trying to push these heavy real-world metaphors, and this is an example called the Magic Cap OS. There's basically a personal assistant interface where they had, you know, a literal desk on the interface. They had a book, a fax machine, a clock, even a Rolodex. My personal favorite on the bottom is the magic lamp. Not quite sure what that was going to do. But what was really interesting is they really extended this metaphor quite far. They had, you know, parts of the operating system where you'd be traveling through a hallway of your office, and then this is an example where you're outside of your office now, you're in the streets, and the internet is just down the block. I don't know if you can read that on the far right side. That tall building is the internet. So, and then of course, you know, the very famous Bob UI, which, you know, Microsoft had sort of played with a lot of those same ideas. And then if some of you are familiar with Kai's photo soap, photo tools, you know, again, those ideas were sort of pushed quite far as like, you know, how real do we make these things? Now, most mainstream UIs didn't quite go that far. As you go from 16 to 32-bit graphics, though, you do see those sort of ideas from the Alto becoming more concrete. It's not as extreme as the physical interfaces I just showed you, but you still see sort of this rendering of materials. The buttons are made out of metal, and there's this idea of physicality. And then, of course, you know, that's continued to be pushed and refined, you know, through the operating systems that we're all familiar with, you know, that are more contemporary. And then in some of the things that we're seeing in just with tablet interfaces, you know, now this idea is coming really, really far, and almost to the point of sort of being reminiscent of those interfaces I showed you a few screens ago, the Magic Cap UI, or even the Bob operating system, or the Bob interface, where we're taking those physical things like shelves and books, and that's the interface. The Bump Top UI is interesting as well, where they took essentially what was a computing metaphor and tried to bring more desktopness to it by dropping it onto a 3D plane. So it's still Windows, except that now it's got sort of perspective, and it has a surface where your files are sitting, and you can move them around and treat them as if they are real physical things. And I think this is one of the first interfaces that, for me, you start to see a really kind of tricky collision of this physical metaphor approach versus things that had emerged in computing that we, you know, hadn't quite figured out what they were yet. For example, things like file names, which we're all familiar with, which don't really have a good physical analog. So when you take file names and you try to place them here, and talking with the creators of this interface, that was actually one of the problems. When you try to put file names on this UI, it kind of falls apart because they needed everything to sort of be squares to work well and sort of collide into each other and to be properly manipulatable. So, and then of course now, again with tablet apps, we see a lot more physical rendering, and again some really extreme stuff, and also in the in Google's Honeycomb UI, you see this 3D idea of, or as I refer to as sort of skeuomorphism, really has taken hold, and that's kind of been the approach to user interface design. It has this long history of coming from these ideas of the desktop and how do we make the desktop, and here's where we are today. And then, of course, with mobile, it's essentially those ideas just made smaller. And so, like I said, I use the word skeuomorphism. Another way to think about this is just sort of artifacts as user interface. And I think the approach here it made sense when we were sort of in the first years of creating computers, that we didn't quite know what these things were yet. We had to use metaphors for them to be understandable and relatable. But I think we've gotten to a point where those metaphors are starting to break down a little bit, and we're getting to this point of how long does it make sense to just keep recreating physical things, because those physical things aren't always they're not always relevant in the way that they used to be. And then as well, this is an example or a quote from Oliver Reichenstein from a studio in Japan called Information Architects, sort of thinking about this approach as well. I think part of the problem is that the metaphors break down, and then some sort of look at this approach as a little bit cheesy or tacky, but then also there's this collision where you see leather buttons. Like, why would we make leather buttons? There aren't leather buttons in the real world, so why does this make sense to have on a user interface? Now, the web sort of has presented a bit of an alternative approach to UI design that I think is interesting. The web kind of, when the web was beginning, it didn't have the kind of same computational power that was present on for client-based interfaces. Instead, you had to really think about bandwidth, right? If you probably all remember dialing into the internet and listening to it, sort of squeak and take forever to get just onto a web page and load up. So web designers had to be really thoughtful and very minimal about how much information they put into a website. And so a lot of websites were basically used common controls that were available from the browser and then text. And so that was sort of the approach of the web, and that's how the web got started. That last page that I showed you, that was the first White House, White House website. This, of course, is the first iteration of Google, and then you can draw that path to present-day websites like Facebook, where that idea actually still sort of lives on. You don't see those kinds of desktop metaphors because they've sort of evolved from an approach of just building more and more information into the site. And it's really been much more information-centric. Similar things from Amazon, eBay, and then Mint, which I think sort of is like a really great example of thinking about just working with the information. So this is a very modern website, which now on the web you can do a lot more with media and rendering, but the approach here has been sort of working with the information they have and sort of think of it as polishing the information rather than just polishing the chrome of the interface. And I think what's really nice about this is it's a new way of thinking about the information that we interact with. Thinking about a book, when you create a book on a phone or a tablet, Adam Greenfield sort of had this thought or this reflection on what it means to create a book on a screen. It's like, do you really want it to be like a real book? Because it's better than a book. It's it's networked, it's got links, it's got videos, there's all this stuff you can do with it, but it's kind of like escaped what books used to be or are. And shouldn't we think about that differently within the interface? And so it's just like, this isn't a book. So why can't we have, why doesn't the interface reflect that? Why would we create these sort of fake rendered pages when it's not really what the book is so much about anymore? And I think what's interesting is this sort of approach to thinking about how do we work with information rather than tools now, looking back on actually Vannevar's original intent with the Memex machine, with this quote, where his intention with the Memex was to sort of increase powers of knowledge and information and intelligence, and not so much recreate physical things. His idea was to sort of push what we could do with information. So, kind of reflecting on all of that sort of is some of, the thinking that went into when we got to a point with Windows Phone, we had an opportunity to rethink the approach with the interface. And so with some of this, thinking behind us, we thought about what is the information that we would want to work with. What makes sense when rebooting a whole interface and taking a new approach to a mobile UI? What kind of stuff? What are the things that are relevant to us when thinking about building that system? And so, some of it is when thinking about moving through a system, we looked to information graphics like this that are familiar in transportation. And we thought, this is a very effective way about thinking about how people move through systems. And that was something that we latched onto, as well as sort of the graphic style and graphic movement that went along with some of that thinking in information graphics. So. Massimo Vignelli's approach to the New York subway system and the sort of Swiss international style that was occurring around the same time. And then the work happening within the Swiss style, the grid systems and the graphic systems. And we looked at all of those as things that we felt were sort of a much more interesting thing to sort of build on when rebooting our UI. And what's interesting when looking at those sort of graphic systems and information systems is that the kind of foundation that's built within those is still relevant and present today. If you look at modern graphic design, you'll see the underlying principles that were built into the international and Swiss style. So still very relevant. And then we looked at other sort of software that we felt was sort of playing off some of these ideas. And we had some of this thinking happening in some of the products, some of the smaller products at Microsoft, like Zune, and then Photosynth, which was purely works with the photos within the system. There's not really sort of a graphic UI that goes around it. It's just the information. Surface as well, which is a purely touch interface, which again, in sort of as a project within Microsoft, thinking about a full touch system, all that Chrome again started to get stripped away, and it was purely about the information that was on the table. And when you have a touch UI, it's very effective because you just work, you just play with the information that you want to interact with. And then in other studies being done at Microsoft, for example, this is an Office sort of view of the future video that had been done a couple years ago, which sort of looked at similar sort of things. And so the theme that you start to see is like we were just much more interested in UI and graphic approaches that were just more sort of information centric, and presented opportunities to think about how to represent that information graphically and lay it out in a beautiful way rather than sort of relying on old metaphors. Now, what's kind of interesting here is to sort of like take a quick look forward is I kind of see this same approach happening in the UI design of science fiction. This is sort of a side interest of mine. Probably like a lot of you love science fiction. And I'm showing a slide from Minority Report. That movie's like 10 years old now, so you can boo. It's like, oh, Minority Report again. But what's sort of interesting in science fiction UI approaches like this, or Iron Man, or even Avatar, is that they don't use sort of trash bins and icons. It's all sort of information. Because I think when they imagine like what would be an interface of the future, it's information overlaying the world. So that's somewhat of a sidestep, but sort of an interesting thing to reflect on, like how we think about where UI design is going to go down the road. And so that kind of path, the things I talked about, sort of the evolution of the web, and then graphic navigational systems, represents to me what I think of more as like information as UI, or you might have heard it sort of being referred to as content-centric, content over Chrome, where the important thing in the UI is the information and representing the information rather than metaphors. And I think this sort of change in value of what the interactive systems we work with every day, if you think about Twitter or Facebook, like there is no physical metaphor for Twitter or Facebook. And these to me are much more sort of, these point to what user interfaces are going to be like down the road much more than calculators. It's much more about how do we work with information and communication. And so I think that sort of change in value from thinking about tools to thinking about information needs sort of a change in expression. The value isn't the physicalness, the value is the information. So when we approached Windows Phone, we created a set of design principles that our team could work from. We have a large design team, and sort of, to keep all the designers sort of focused in the same direction and to guide ourselves, we created some design principles that reflected a lot of this thinking: clean, light, open, and fast, celebrating typography, giving life to the UI through motion rather than fake 3D effects, surfacing the content over the Chrome, and creating something that we felt was sort of authentically digital. And what we mean by that is, not creating something that feels like fake wood or fake metal, but that sort of just was more authentic to the screens that we were working with. We created kind of a philosophy or a point of view around Metro. This is what we refer to as the design language, because I mean, this was such, as you can imagine, at Microsoft, this was a new approach to UI. We had this very, this other approach existing within our company, and we had to really create sort of a rallying philosophy around Metro. And we created a lot of material to sort of support what we were trying to do. And through the Metro system, some of the things that we concentrated a lot of time on was being very uncompromising with the typography. Icons still play a role, but we really toned down our work there. So instead of spending lots and lots of time rendering icons, we kind of let them sort of take a back seat. And we said, that's not the best use of our time. I mean, we still take a lot of care in them. It's just not the forefront of the UI. The content is the forefront. Within the UI itself, we tried to create a framework sort of very much in the spirit, I think, of the Swisher International style, is that it's a framework that allows you to sort of build in the content appropriately. So these are basically the same UI control in 4 different parts of our system, and by putting in different kinds of content, the same foundational system feels very, very different, and it can express different things. We used color to express different sort of moods within the UI. We had a very strong classic grid to kind of hold it all together, and that was essentially kind of what is the basis of the Metro UI system. And we like this video when thinking about that shift, and because we try to communicate what is it that we're trying to think about differently here. And this video, I think, kind of sums it up nicely.
This is Life magazine, 1953. One ad after another in here. It just kind of shows every single visual bad habit that was endemic in those days. You've got zany hand lettering everywhere, just swatch typography to kind of signify elegance, exclamation points, exclamation points, cursive wedding invitation typography down here reading "almost everyone appreciates the best." This was everywhere in the 50s. This is how everything looked in the 50s. You cut to, this is after Helvetica was in full swing, same product. No people, no smiling fakery, just a beautiful big glass of ice cold Coke. The slogan underneath, "It's the real thing, period. Coke, period. In Helvetica, period. Any questions? Of course not. Drink Coke, period." Simple.
So like I said, we really like that video because for us it was it was a way to talk about what we were doing differently compared to our old UI. There's lots of gloss and distraction and lots of things happening, and that shift from that to this, where it's just about the content that you want. It's just about the things that are important to you. Any questions? No, of course not. Use Windows Phone. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about were apps. And apps also represent sort of a different approach that we've taken here, and something we've been talking a lot about with our app developers is apps obviously are very important. There's lots of apps. You've all heard a lot about apps over the last couple of years, I'm sure. When we were sort of getting ready to launch Windows Phone, we were launching a new product in a world where apps were very, very important. And of course, when you launch a new product, you're starting kind of from zero. And you look at what where our competition was at. There was they all had existing app marketplaces, and they're all moving very quickly. There's tons of interest in those marketplaces, and we sort of had to figure out how are we going to sort of build that same interest. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this also allowed us to step back and think, well, how do we think differently about apps where maybe they, we can think about the use of apps a little differently within our system. This is one more quote that sort of emphasizes the importance of apps right now from Robert Scoble. This is from about a year ago. Nothing matters in this world more than apps. Write that on your forehead, write that on the mirror on your bathroom wall, write that on your car windshield, whatever it will take so you remember it. Apps are the only thing that matters now. Forget everything else. They're the only thing that is important. At least in my world, in mobile design, that is a very sort of rings fairly true. Like they're very important for the success of our product. But what's really interesting about looking at the use of apps is that the average app, this is kind of what its use pattern looks like. Someone downloads it, they use it once, and then the use drop off is extremely severe. And this is sort of an average aggregate across apps. This is over 100 days. And actually, notice that some don't even necessarily get used even once. And then it varies a little bit differently within the different categories of apps. So entertainment, sports, games. Some sort of have a more likelihood of being used more often up front, but they all kind of tail off at the end. And basically, the way to think about this is the average application is used once. And only 1% of downloaded applications are used in the long run. So we hear about hundreds of thousands of apps and how important apps are, and yet the sort of unfortunate truth is that a lot of those apps just don't get used very often, if at all. And I kind of equate this to, I'm one of those guys who has a toolbox at home with lots of tools, but the only tool I ever use is my screwdriver. And so apps are kind of like that. You find the one tool, the one screwdriver, and you use it all the time. And I think the way a lot of UIs or mobile UIs or other UIs were being designed sort of promote that, because you kind of have like a top of your system, and then you have a silo of these different applications. So a user has to remember which apps they have and then to go into them regularly. So we started to thinking about this differently, where could we connect the apps and the system more fluidly, so that it wasn't sort of like if you didn't remember your app, you'd never go to it, but that these kind of apps were sort of more woven into the system. And we created a kind of another sort of philosophy within the system of Windows Phone that we called personal, relevant, and connected. And it was referred to these as sort of red threads, or like themes that should run through every app that we're designing. And what it meant is we just wanted every application, whatever it was, as simple as email or photos, to feel personal to you, to be relevant to your context and the date and time and the content you have, and to be connected. And so the way that manifests itself within our UI, for example, within our People Hub, we really thought differently about our contact list. So instead of just being a contact book with a bunch of phone numbers and emails of your different contacts, we thought in a modern UI, those should be connected and relevant to the people you communicate with. I mean, you're connected on Twitter, you're connected on Facebook. And so within our People Hub, when you go in, you first see the people you've most recently been talking to. And this is people that you've been, gone to check out their Facebook page, not necessarily just called them, but you've maybe interacted with them on Twitter. Of course, you have all your contacts, and then you have what's new. So often a lot of people will go into their People Hub and not even necessarily use that to kick off a phone call, but they'll use that just to see what's new on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, because we bring all those apps together into one place. So instead of having to remember to go to this app or this app or this app, we just kind of weave them into the more commonly used parts of the phone. Pictures is another example where going into the application, you have, again, what's new, so photos that have been uploaded to Facebook, you have photos you've recently taken, and then even the background of the application is a photo that you've recently taken. So we have this kind of framework that allows content to come in so that my photo application looks different than your photo application because it's using my content versus your content. Music and video is a similar sort of thing. The music and videos you've been listening to recently, and it's not just the videos or music you've been listening to recently within this application. If you were watching video recently, like within YouTube application, or Netflix, that pipes in here. So, and then on the right-hand side, you have the extras, which is related applications. So you may go to the music and videos hub to look for some music, and then it might not be there, so you might bounce out to the Last.fm hub or the Last.fm application. So you don't have to remember about that application. We kind of try to weave it in. In addition, on the top, on the start screen, we took a slightly different approach to icons. We have what we call tiles. So it's quite a large square, which you can fit a lot of information into, and we try to make them live. So instead of it just being an icon, it actually can be live representation of what's going on inside of the application. So in some cases, really useful tiles, you don't even necessarily need to open the application anymore. So a weather tile, like you see sort of to the top right, if I see the weather and I can see that it's sunny and I can see the temperature, I don't even necessarily need to open the application. Or the maps application, or the traffic one there just below the weather, where I can actually focus it on an intersection that I particularly care about, because that intersection of the 405 and 520 in Seattle gets particularly jammed up. So I can just look at that without even opening the app. And then within an app, sort of taking that personal, relevant, and connected approach all together, something as simple as a weather application can become this, where on the left-hand side, you see a start tile, which has the surfaced weather information from the app. The app itself, is relevant because the city that I'm in is I'm in Las Vegas, so it shows me the weather from Las Vegas. And on the right-hand side, even building in some socialness to it. So looking at who my contacts are and saying these cities might be relevant to me as well, because my family lives in Canada, and my wife's at home now in Seattle, and I might want to see what that weather looks like there while I'm traveling. So what we've effectively been trying to do is move away from a system that's very siloed and forces you to jump into these different applications and get to something that feels more web-like, where it's all kind of connected and moving through the system is much more fluid, and you don't have to remember all these different applications because they all kind of connect to each other. So the last bit that I'll talk about is ecosystems, and this is sort of some new thinking around that slide that I mentioned a little bit ago, where we're coming into a market with lots and lots of existing applications under competition. So how do you launch a new product in a world that needs all these applications? And I think, and you're starting from zero. Now, I think that's very relevant within mobile because we've been hearing about it so much, but I think there's other parts or other products where this is also very relevant, where you might want to think about how you build an ecosystem. And I'll use a mobile example, and you might think about how that could extend to other things as well. When you think about mobile, it wasn't that long ago when launching a phone was actually kind of, I don't want to say easy, but it felt easier. Because basically what you did is you got really talented industrial designers, you created a really beautiful, thin phone that had the latest specs. Now, I've been told, by the way, just before I came out here, that Motorola wasn't very popular in Brazil. But at least in the United States, this phone was super, super popular. So I don't know how it did here. But this phone did really, really well. The UI wasn't very great. It wasn't connected to anything. Didn't have apps. But basically, it was really, really nice design. And then they did lots of advertising like this. So you'd see all kinds of billboards where the phone, if you didn't see it, is in her hand. It's pretty small. But she's pretty good looking, and she's using a razor. So I want to use one too. And then the next year or a couple years later, they kind of do it again. They take the phone and they move some bits around. The software is different, who knows? But it's smaller, it's sleeker, it's thinner. And then another girl, and she's also holding the phone, and she looks cool, so I want to use that phone too. And I think that sort of approach in design is still it's breaking down a little bit within mobile, particularly because of apps, because you can't really compete with that. You can't compete with ecosystems when you have that approach. But I think that approach is really common in design. And if any of you have heard the word iconic or used the word iconic and feel about that word the same way that I do, it sort of reflects that approach where we have this history of design that's sort of about creating these beautiful, monolithic, very special products that don't touch it. It's perfect. It's beautiful. Just look at it, and just be in awe of how amazing it is. We have, and this is sort of the stuff that, at least when I went to design school, this is the kind of stuff you studied. These are sort of these perfect examples of the perfect solution. It is self-contained. Don't mess with it. It is perfect. And there's many sort of examples in the history of design that kind of reflect this way of thinking. And then hopefully it's you take this approach and then you win a design award, and people will sort of talk about you and how amazing that design was, and it'll go in a history book. But like I said, that approach doesn't work, and those design awards are somewhat irrelevant in a world where people are looking at the number of apps that you have, not the number of awards that you have. They're looking at what can I do with this product? How can I hack it? How can I put my stuff in it? How can I make it do what I want it to do? Because when you take that sort of siloed product or like singular iconic product approach, I mean, it's easy for people to walk away from. Even if you convince them that it is absolutely beautiful, as soon as the next beautiful thing comes out, they can walk away from your product and they can go to the next product. And so people are, so the approach that you need to take is sort of much more thinking about sort of the system that you're going to, build for people to kind of envelop themselves with, the solutions that you have. And so, when we think about Windows and Windows Phone, obviously, if you've seen Metro and you've seen the design languages extending to Xbox and to Windows 8 as well, because we want people to sort of feel like all these products complement each other, and that if you have a Windows Phone, it works great with Xbox and it works great with Windows, and all these things sort of are a product family. And obviously, the iPhone did this very, very well with their accessory marketplace, where like you can buy a phone and you can get all kinds of different things that you can put onto the phone. I mean, the iPhone is basically like, if you think about it, I mean, it's a rectangular brick. Like it doesn't really have a lot of shape to it, but that's perfect for accessories because people can buy it and put like anything they want on it. And that kind of phone style was, several years ago, people would do sort of much more complicated, curvy things that you couldn't sort of have this kind of accessory ecosystem built around. Kinect is an example of sort of, a product where we didn't even sort of have the SDK available yet, and people cracked it open and started playing with it. This in particular is a shadow puppet thing that people built with Kinect. And I think this kind of like want to crack things open and do things with it and sort of extend the abilities of products, it makes sense in a world where, of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, where people are very used to sort of remixing and, creating their own environments and doing what they want with them and building on them and shaping them the way they want. And, they expect their products to sort of work with all these other things that they're remixing. This to me is a perfect example of that. This is Twitter. This is a Twitter. Twitter isn't the Twitter web page. Twitter is kind of this world of Twitter activity. This is 24 hours of Twitter activity around the world. And this, to me, represents Twitter in two different ways, in that it is this community ecosystem that they've gathered, and it's also the ability for people to build stuff like this, because the Twitter APIs are so open that it allows people to kind of build new ways to experience Twitter. And then, like I sort of showed with the iPhone cases, there's a similar sort of thing that you can do with hardware, but it's much more limited to platforms that have consistent components. So, cameras, you can do it because they all have that screw at the bottom. And so you see this kind of stuff coming out on Kickstarter. And then people are doing it as well with products that sort of have a more unified body. So if you're creating a product that's very curvaceous, like I mentioned, it's very tough to build these kinds of accessories for. The iPod Nano was, a great platform to build accessories on, and this accessory has done extremely well for both Scott, who's designed it, and the iPod Nano. And just doing a quick scrub of Quickstarter, you can see that the ecosystems or the things that people are sort of building on in Kickstarter map to products that are more open or create more opportunities to remix on them. So products where they don't have a consistent platform. So if you take two BlackBerries, they put the jacks in different places. But if you take two iPhones, the jacks are always in the same place. That makes it easier for people to build accessories on them. And so iPad and iPhone are benefiting from that. And so we've been looking at this and wondering, like, how do we kickstart that same kind of ecosystem in the apps world? I think with products, some years ago, I remember people sort of talking about it in terms of like, how do we open up? How do we let people participate? And now it's, how do you get people to participate? Because there's so many things for people to participate in now. Like, how do you actually get that participation going? So for us, with having a new product, how do we get people to build those applications that we need? And it made us sort of rethink who the designer is. So thinking about iconicness, we used to think about designers as sort of like, who's the rock star? Like, who's this like really awesome designer? This is my boss. As I like using this slide. Yeah, he's kind of a rock star. But like, we used to think about these sort of rock star designers, the designers who have the big name, and like, what is the thing that they made? And we're trying to get away from that. And I think the last years, obviously a lot of us probably work on design teams. This is the Windows, some of the people from the Windows Phone design team. Our team is super important. It's the phone was not designed by one person. The phone was designed by a studio of 50 people working together very, very closely. But I think the thing that we're thinking very differently about now is, to design Windows Phone, it's not even about the rockstar designer or the design team, it's about the community. We need that community to sort of all be caring about Windows Phone and building things for Windows Phone to sort of build that ecosystem around it. And so, we put on a lot of events like Mix and Remix, which are basically opportunities for people who are interested in what we're doing, developers to come in and, for people like me and some of my colleagues to talk to them about what we're doing and what we care about and what design for Windows Phone means. And then, my developer colleagues to talk about, best practices for building Windows Phones and, basically just get people really excited about Windows Phone and building it because, it's not just our phone, it's their phone. We all need to be working together to sort of build this platform and ecosystem up. And so we do a lot of stuff like this. So this is Albert again. We have Microsoft has its own kind of technology channel where we put on different. So it's a website where we put on kind of web episodes where we talk to people live about different topics. The Windows Phone design team, actually, we even do this ourselves. We have a Windows Phone design team Twitter account where we try to engage with people who are interested in designing for Windows Phone. And this isn't a separate team. This is us internally. So we have a handful of designers within the team who check the account regularly to answer questions and sort of point people to information. We go to a lot of events like this. This is just an example of the kind of things we've been at over the last year. A lot of the different designers from the team go off and speak, and because we're excited about Windows Phone and we want you guys to be excited about Windows Phone and we want to tell you about Windows Phone and answer questions about Windows Phone because we need people like you guys to be interested in what we're doing and come work on it with us. We put on a lot of we call it design days where we send people out and talk about the system and again sort of how to build for it, and then we actually even we'll go meet with developers and review their applications and talk about what we might do differently, how they could make their app run more efficiently, etc. Because we need this. And so, we need to be thinking about how do we build to that and how do we get that that community going. Brenda Laurel, some of you might be familiar with her. She, very wise woman. She had this quote from a few years ago, sort of that was pointing to this kind of way of thinking, where she said, "A design isn't finished until somebody's using it." But I think this exact quote is actually somewhat outdated at this point, actually, because I think it's more that a design isn't finished until a community takes over. So I think there's a lot of products now where, like, you're not done when you finish, the tooling and put the product on the shelf and you walk away. The product to succeed needs active engagement with your community. And that's very, very true in mobile, but I think there's a lot of other product spaces where that will become true. And then I think there's a lot of product spaces that will be disrupted by people who do this, and people who don't do this are going to be caught left behind. If you're familiar with, some of you might have heard of the Nest thermostat. Think about that, like thermostats, like nobody was paying attention to thermostats. It's kind of just a commodity product. And now here's a company that I think, is taking a very different approach to it and is very actively, talking about it and sort of bringing interest in. And I think we'd see them doing this kind of thing. They've created a thermostat that's connected to your phone, and you'll be able to they'll be able to build a community around it. And I think there's a lot more other product opportunities that are just sort of waiting for people to take the same approach. So that's essentially mobile now. That's the kind of stuff that we're working on and interested in. Like I said, design, we're trying to move from a place of thinking about artifacts to how do we think about shaping information and working with information. On the apps, it's sort of about trying to break down those silos between apps and just sort of having these many individual apps to having a system that kind of weaves them all together. And third, sort of the present one for us is thinking about building an ecosystem and getting people sort of involved in our community. And we're very excited that we've had a huge amount of participation in the last year. We're a new platform coming out. We went from 0 to 40,000 apps in a year, and sort of from doing stuff like that. I think that's the kind of thing that I think many of you probably have opportunities to think about that in your own work. So that's it. I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you again for having me, and